He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam a door. He just looked at me like I was a stranger trying on his last name for fun. "You're a barren woman playing house," Derek said, his eyes flat. I stood still in the middle of the kitchen holding a mug that had gone cold in my hands. Steam used to rise from it, now nothing did. Just like us. The adoption brochures were torn and scattered across the granite island. Pages crumpled like leaves at the foot of a dying tree. I had left them out last night, thinking maybe today, just maybe, he'd say yes. Instead, he slapped the counter with the prenup papers I had refused to sign years ago. "Sign this. It's over." "Stop pretending," he said. "Is this really about the children?" I asked. My voice didn't even shake. Maybe I had gone numb already. "It's always been about the children, Savannah," came a voice behind him. Marjorie Langford. His mother. Her heels tapped softly on the hardwood floor as she entered, her perfume arriving before she did something sharp and citrusy that burned more than it soothed. "You never could give him what he needs," she said, taking her place beside her son like a queen beside a prince. "Leave your key. The locks change in 1 hour." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled the key from my pocket and let it fall. The sound it made on the tile was small, too small for something that had unlocked so much of my life. Then I reached for my wedding ring. It slid off easier than I expected, and I set it next to the unsigned papers. It looked so tiny there, lost between the fine print and the edge of the granite. Maria, the housekeeper, was the only one who met my eyes as I picked up my coat. She offered me a tissue quietly. "I packed a lunch for you, Miss Reilly," she whispered. I almost broke then. Almost. Outside, Derek's silver Porsche and Marjorie's black Mercedes framed my dusty Honda Civic like sentinels guarding a future I was no longer invited to. The sky over Seattle was weeping. Cold rain hammered the windshield as I turned the key, hands trembling. My whole life fit into 2 suitcases in the trunk and a glove box full of receipts for things we'd bought together: furniture, vacations, crib catalogs. But the back seat was empty. I rented a room in a short-term sublet in Ballard, the kind of place that smelled faintly of cumin and someone else's sadness. I stared at the ceiling most nights, listening to the upstairs neighbors argue about takeout orders. 2 weeks later, I sat in a waiting room, dressed for an interview at a nonprofit downtown. My resume was in my bag, printed on cream paper. I had practiced my answers. I was ready to rebuild. Until I wasn't. I collapsed before they called my name. The world tilted, then faded. When I came to, there was a monitor beside me and the slow, steady beep of something more reliable than Derek had ever been. "Mrs. Langford," a nurse asked. "Number Miss Reilly," I corrected automatically. A young doctor entered, tablet in hand. "Miss Reilly, I'm Dr. Calder. You're going to be okay, but there's something we need to talk about." I waited. "You're pregnant," he said. I blinked. "With twins." That's when the room got quiet. Not because they left, but because the sound inside me was louder. It was the shattering of everything I thought I knew about myself. I stared at the ceiling again. This time not in an apartment but a hospital bed. And again I heard it, the same beep, but now it was multiplied. 2 distinct heartbeats. "But they told me I couldn't," I whispered. Dr. Calder smiled gently. "Well, nature found a way. No one tells you what it feels like to go from empty to everything in under 10 seconds. I didn't cry. There was no room for that. Later, when they gave me the printout, I held it like it might fall apart. 2 tiny shapes, 2 pulses, proof that life had other plans. Back at the apartment, I taped the printout to the smudged mirror above the dresser. He'd never believe it. But these babies weren't for him. They were mine. And someday when they asked, I'd tell them the truth started the moment their father walked away. Because sometimes the end of something isn't a loss. It's an opening. A door you didn't know existed. And I was about to walk through it. The NICU didn't sleep. Not ever. It pulsed with quiet urgency, machines breathing for those too small to breathe on their own. The soft whir of oxygen, the beep of monitors, the rhythm of survival. They didn't lull you to rest. They reminded you every second that life was still trying. I stood with my forehead pressed to the incubator wall, whispering the chorus of a lullaby I half remembered from childhood. Noah kicked softly inside. Caleb's fists were tight as shells. 3 pounds each. Their lungs fighting to catch up to their hearts. They didn't know the name Derek. But I did. I remembered his voice clear as if he'd been in the room. Some women weren't built to nurture, he had said once when I burned dinner and spilled milk on a contract. Now I was nurturing 2 fragile beings with nothing but willpower and formula samples I begged from the hospital nurse. My own body gave up before they were full term. But I wouldn't. I slept upright in the cafeteria, some nights sipping coffee that tasted like wet paper. Other nights I pumped every 3 hours in the closet-sized lactation room, my hands blistered, my skin cracked. The milk never came easily. Sometimes it didn't come at all. Still I kept going. Back at the apartment in Tacoma, a moldy studio with peeling paint, I taped up Noah and Caleb's name tags above the sink. They weren't home yet, but I wanted them to feel expected. My job as a janitor at the neighborhood church ended abruptly when I missed 3 shifts in a row. They left the notice on the door. Medical inconsistency. Like grief and motherhood were something I could pencil in. I rationed the last of the formula samples. I watered it down more than I should have. And that's when he knocked. Miguel Alvarez. My neighbor across the hall. He was old enough to call me Mija without it sounding condescending. He wore brown slippers and a wool cardigan even when it wasn't cold. "You look like you're carrying the whole world," he said, softly holding out a chipped mug. Chamomile. My late wife swore by it. I thanked him and leaned against the doorframe. The tea was warm. But it was the first human kindness I'd felt since Maria the housekeeper. He started showing up every other evening. Sometimes with leftovers, sometimes with silence. But one night he came with a stack of books. Heavy ones. Law, I asked, blinking. Yes. You have instincts, Mija. But instincts need armor. Learn to protect with more than love. I flipped open a thick textbook, unsure where to even begin. That week Noah came off oxygen for the first time. I celebrated with half a candy bar and a cup of powdered coffee. Caleb caught a mild infection and fought through it like a storm. Miguel saw the dark crescents under my eyes and didn't say a word. He just brewed more tea and opened to a bookmarked page. "You were born to protect," he said. "Now learn how to shield." When the nurse handed me the weekly update, I noticed they had gained 2 ounces each. That was everything. On my walk home from the hospital, my shoes soaked through in the Tacoma drizzle, I repeated what Miguel had said under my breath. Shield. Not just survive. He handed me a business card a few nights later. Worn edges. Ink faded. Professor Lynn Donnelly, University of Washington School of Law. "She owes me a favor," he said, almost like an afterthought. I didn't ask. I just held the card for a long moment. Like it might open a door I hadn't dared to knock on. That night, I stared at the 2 cribs I'd bought secondhand with grocery store gift cards. One of the blankets had a small hole. It didn't bother me. Not anymore. I didn't cry. I sat at the tiny kitchen table, pulled out my laptop, and typed FAFSA application into the browser. The sound of machines still rang in my ears. But for the first time, it wasn't fear. It was momentum. I used to think I'd feel nothing. If I ever saw him again, Derek, I'd be ice. But that was before he walked into my mediation room. The door opened with a soft click. I didn't even look up at first. I was highlighting a clause in a custody agreement for Melissa, my client. Shaky hands, quiet voice, 2 kids, 1 manipulative ex. "Savannah," she whispered, her breath catching. I glanced up to reassure her. And then my breath caught too. He stepped through the glass door in a charcoal suit, the same type he used to wear when he'd come home late and toss his tie on the back of a chair. His hair was shorter. There were faint lines at the edges of his eyes now. But the smirk, that hadn't changed. Derek Langford. Behind him, a woman trailed in light steps and a bright floral dress that looked like it belonged to a garden brunch. She looked maybe 30. Wide eyes. Perfect posture. a file clutched to her chest like a shield. She smiled at Melissa, then at me. "Hi, I'm Ashley. I'll be assisting Derek today." Assist. The word hung like perfume in the air. I stood calmly smoothing my skirt. Savannah Reilly. Counsel for Miss Chambers. His eyes found my nameplate on the table, then drifted to the framed photo beside it. Noah and Caleb. 8 years old. Taken last spring. Matching raincoats, muddy boots, huge grins. His breath visibly caught. I didn't blink. He sat slowly, his hands stiff on the edge of the table. He hadn't expected this. Not me in a tailored blazer. Not my voice calm, firm, practiced. Not those boys either. I guided Melissa to her seat, kept my tone clinical. As agreed, this is an informal mediation between Melissa Chambers and Mr. Trent Doyle. Miss Chambers will speak through counsel. Mr. Doyle's representation, I'll handle it directly, Derek cut in. His voice was smooth, but his gaze never returned to mine. Ashley took notes, nodding. She hadn't noticed yet. Or maybe she had but chose not to react. The negotiation began. Custody schedules. Visitation concerns. A disagreement over birthday weekends. Melissa shrank smaller with every sentence Derek spoke. I leaned forward gently but firmly, redirecting. No, Melissa isn't refusing communication. She's requesting structure given the documented incidents in May and August. His jaw clenched. Ashley passed him a sticky note with something in curly handwriting. During the break, the silence in the room felt heavy. I walked to refill my coffee just as Ashley rose and glanced at the photo again. "They're adorable," she said brightly. "Are they yours?" I paused for a second, let the quiet settle like dust. Derek's head tilted ever so slightly. "They're mine," I said, "and yes, they're his too." I turned to Ashley, though he never wanted to know. Her smile flickered. There was no anger in my voice. No accusation. Just a truth left long unattended. Derek stood by the window staring at something that wasn't there. Ashley excused herself politely, murmuring something about returning a call. Melissa leaned in. "Was that him?" I nodded. "You okay?" I smiled. "More than okay." The session ended without incident. Melissa signed the draft with trembling hands, then gripped mine tight. "Thank you for not letting me disappear." After they left, I stood alone in the conference room for a long minute. I looked down at the photo. Noah had lost a tooth the week that picture was taken. Caleb insisted on keeping a frog in his jacket pocket until it hopped out during Target checkout. Their chaos. Their laughter. They were mine. And they would never be invisible to me. 2 mornings later, I arrived at the office early. The cleaning crew had just left. Everything smelled faintly of lemon and paper. There on the floor under my door lay a white envelope. Heavy cardstock. I bent to pick it up. My name handwritten. I opened it. "Derek Langford and Ashley Whitmore request the honor of your presence." I didn't wear red to stand out. I wore it so he'd remember the color of warning. The elevator climbed so quietly I could hear my own breath. My palms were dry. My heels didn't click. I'd picked them that way. I didn't want noise. Outside, Seattle glittered like it was trying too hard to be alive. Inside the Columbia Tower Club, people murmured over flutes of champagne tuxedo buttons and lacquered smiles. The kind of party where the air smelled of legacy and lemon-polished floors. I stepped into the ballroom alone. No name tag. No +1. Just me in a crimson gown with clean lines and a neckline that spoke of confidence, not seduction. My hair pinned up. Eyes quiet. They looked. Of course they did. Even Marjorie Langford, queen of the Northern elite, paused mid-sip. Ashley found me first. "Oh, you came," she was radiant. Soft curls, pale gold dress eyes like they still believed. She took my hand gently as if we were old friends being reintroduced. "You're Savannah, right? You know Derek from?" I smiled. Tilted my head slightly, once. Her eyes twinkled, searching my face for something I didn't let surface. "Well, I'm so glad you could make it." He's around somewhere, probably cornered by Judge Halford again. I let her go with a nod. The string quartet played a familiar tune. Vivaldi, but slower. I moved along the wall past slices of conversation, real estate, politics, holiday plans in the San Juans. None of it reached me. Near the edge of the ballroom stood the gift table. Velvet cloth, a tower of silver-wrapped boxes, and engraved cards tied with ribbon. I slipped the envelope between two gifts. Cream paper. Inside, one photograph. Two boys in raincoats. The same raincoats Derek had never seen. Noah with his snaggletooth grin. Caleb squinting into sun. Identical smiles. I turned away before anyone noticed. Before my hands could shake, the lights dimmed. A toast was called. Derek stood at the front, flanked by Ashley and Marjorie. His tie was darker than his suit. His voice sounded practiced. To futures earned, and to those who walk beside us. The crowd lifted glasses. Chimes clinked, soft applause. Ashley reached toward the gift table during the applause, smiling playfully as she picked up my envelope. She opened it casually. She looked. She didn't blink at first. Then her mouth parted. Her fingers twitched. She looked at Derek. Then at me. Derek turned slowly. His eyes met mine over the crowd, and something inside him cracked. There were sounds. A dropped flute. Someone gasped. Ashley stepped forward, photograph still in hand. She didn't raise her voice, but in a room that quiet, she didn't need to. "They're your kids." Her eyes searched his face. Then mine. I didn't move. "Yes, and no, I didn't come to ruin your night." I stepped forward slowly. "But maybe it's time someone told you the truth." Derek's hand hovered midair like he could catch what had already fallen. Ashley's eyes welled, something between realization and betrayal. Then she walked. Not fast. Not loud. She just walked off the stage. The room didn't breathe. Marjorie didn't move. Her lips tightened just slightly. She reached for her glass. And Derek, he just stood there. Surrounded by guests, music, success. Alone. I turned. Walked through the sea of whispers. Near the elevator, someone murmured soft as a thought slipping out. They looked just like him. And that was the loudest justice I'd ever heard. As the doors slid shut, I let my shoulders drop. Not in defeat, but in the kind of silence that follows when a weight finally leaves your chest. The kind of silence that makes room for breath. And a future. His first voicemail said, "I'm sorry." His 10th said, "Please." The rest were silence wrapped in digital static. Gaps where words didn't quite land. It had been a week since the party. Since the envelope. Since Ashley walked off the stage and left Derek frozen in his own unraveling. I hadn't returned any messages. But I hadn't blocked them either. That morning the kitchen smelled like cinnamon toast. Not because it was the holidays, but because Caleb insisted. He'd woken early, tried to make it himself, and left the butter out. Noah was on the floor sketching something in crayon. He said it was a dragon. I could tell it was our cat in a cape. The table was cluttered. A cracked cereal bowl. A flyer for the school winter pageant. And a letter. Not mine. The boys had written it together the night before, heads huddled close, whispering like conspirators. They didn't ask permission, they just asked if we had envelopes. Now it sat sealed and slightly crooked. Their handwriting uneven but proud across the front, to Derek. I didn't touch it. Instead, I poured more milk into Caleb's bowl and asked, "What do you want him to know?" They looked at each other, then at me. Caleb spoke first. "That we don't hate him." Noah added, "That we're not sure yet." Theo stepped into the kitchen, his voice warm as always. He kissed my temple. "Morning, gang." He didn't ask about the letter. He just poured himself coffee and whistled faintly along to the Christmas music playing from the tiny speaker near the window. After school drop-off, I read the draft they left on the counter. 4 lines. 4 truths. Do you like baseball? Are you sorry? Do you want to meet us? Do you know we exist now? It was more direct than anything I ever wrote to him. And somehow it was kinder too. Miguel came by later that afternoon bringing tea and legal briefs. He glanced at the envelope. "You gonna send it?" I nodded slowly. "I think they already did." He chuckled. "Smart boys." That night I received an email from Ashley. Just one sentence. "Thank you for saving me too." I stared at it longer than I expected to. 2 days later a letter arrived. Real paper. Handwriting I hadn't seen in almost 9 years. The envelope was simple, inside 3 pages. No drama. No justification. Just him. He answered each question. He loved baseball. Played second base in college. Yes, he was sorry, though he knew that meant little now. He wanted to meet them, but only if they wanted him to. And yes, he knew they existed now. And that knowing them even from afar had undone something inside him. He ended with one line, "You don't need me, but I'd like to be someone who shows up." I let the letter sit on the table that night. I didn't tell the boys right away. The next morning Noah read it first. Then Caleb. They didn't say much. But after dinner Noah crawled onto the couch beside me, held my hand and asked quietly, "If we meet him, you come with us." "Right," I nodded. "Always." He didn't say "I love you." He didn't try to claim them. He just knelt and listened. The office was small, warm, and smelled faintly of lavender. "Doctor." Sarah Kim had a soft voice and a softer clock, one that ticked like a heartbeat instead of a drum. In the corner sat a bin of wooden toys no one touched. Theo sat beside me, close but not shielding. Noah and Caleb walked in first. On their own 2 feet. 9 years of growth of nights, with fevers and laughter of first steps and fractured teeth all converging in this moment. Derek stood when they entered. Then he knelt. Not like a man asking forgiveness, but like someone asking permission to stay still. No one spoke for a beat. And then Caleb, eyes direct and voice steady, asked, "Why didn't you want us?" Derek's breath caught, his hands opened empty. "I was weak," he said. "I listened to the wrong people. I thought, if I left before you were real, I could pretend it never happened. That I wasn't afraid." He looked up. "It wasn't your fault. Not even a little." Noah nodded once. Then pulled something from his coat pocket. A pair of leather gloves. Well-worn secondhand. But clean. "For you. If you ever want to play catch or something." Derek didn't cry. But something inside him folded inward like a closing book. Dr. Kim smiled gently. "That's a good place to pause." As we stood to leave, I spoke quietly. "Everything from here on is supervised. Public. Conditional. You don't get titles, you get time." He nodded. Didn't argue. Theo reached for my hand. I took it. 3 months later, I stood in front of the Monroe Legal Alliance's new office, smaller, sunnier, with a little blue welcome mat I'd picked out with the boys. They liked it because it said "Still Standing." The wedding was held on a Sunday morning. Small garden. Chamomile flowers and white chairs. Theo wore navy. Miguel wore a crooked tie and a grin wide as summer. He toasted after the vows. She didn't just rise, she remembered everyone who never got to. The guests clapped. I smiled. Later that evening, after the laughter had quieted, I opened the envelope. It had arrived in a box marked only with my name. Inside was a letter. Marjorie's handwriting. Elegant. Controlled. But different this time, less rigid. "Savannah, you broke the pattern I didn't know I was repeating. That's braver than forgiveness." I folded the letter once. Didn't cry. The sun dipped. My sons came to stand beside me. And when it was time, they walked me down the aisle. Theo waited steady. I kissed the man I chose for myself, and in that moment I realized revenge is nothing but clarity with good lighting.